right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Living One. I'm your host, Olivia Crossman. Living One is Kerulos' monthly webinar series, now in its fifth year. With guest speakers from around the world, we listen in to how people are bringing their ethics, minds, and lives into alignment with nature for earth and animal liberation and revitalization. We ask the question, we know what's wrong, but what does right look like? Most importantly, how do we get from wrong to right? When there is so much to change and to heal, where do we begin? What's the first step? What is the path each of us can undertake to make positive, deep, transformative change, not only as individuals, but as a collective whole? What's ours to do? Let's talk about it. This year, Living One hosts and hears from individuals who have forged a range of unique and inspiring paths to help transform and heal Earth, animals, and human society. Join us for another year of rich conversations to learn how, individually and in community, we can take the necessary, concrete, timely steps towards a right world, a world of peace and wellness for all Earth beings. Kim Stallwood is an author and independent scholar with more than 45 years of personal commitment as a vegan and professional experience in leadership positions with some of the world's leading animal rights organizations. He is a leader in preserving the history of the animal rights movement. The British Library in London acquired the Kim Stallwood Archive in 2020. Tier im Recht, the Zurich-based animal law organization, established the Kim Stallwood Collection in 2022. He is a member of the Culture and Animals Foundation Board of Directors and served as the volunteer executive director of Minding Animals International from 2012 to 2017. His book, Growl, was published by Lantern in 2014. He is a contributor to various academic anthologies. Currently, he is writing the biography of Topsy, the female Asian elephant electrocuted to death on Coney Island, New York, in 1903. He holds dual UK and US citizenship and lives in England. Before we begin, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that we are all currently on various different Indigenous lands. I am currently on the ancestral homelands of the Council of the Three Fires, which includes the Ojibwa, Ottawa, and Potawatomi. This land exists also as a place of trade with other Indigenous communities, including the Ho-Chunk, Miami, Menominee, Sauk, and Meskwaki. The Kerulos Center for Nonviolence is located on the homelands of the grizzly bear, takelma, daku-betete, coyote, coho salmon, golden eagle, and gray wolf. Finally, we ask that all of us participate with full respect and attention to each other in the spirit of peace and wisdom that Living One seeks to foster. So without further ado, we welcome Kim Stallwood. Hi, Kim. Thank you for joining us today.
Hello, Olivia. Thank you for inviting me back. It's a great honor.
It's great to have you here again. To get started, do you want to tell us a little bit about what you cared about as a child and if this was encouraged?
Um, well, I was born and raised in a very ordinary working class family in social housing, and my parents were very loving, and I had a sister who's a little older than me, and there was nothing really to mark out our lives as being anything special or unique in any way. We did have a cat whose name was Tinkerbell, and Tinkerbell was rescued as a kitten around the time that I was born. So grew up with Tinkerbell, and I can remember in my early teens when Tinkerbell died that was my first introduction to death. But we were a family who ate very ordinary food, and as I was growing up, I got a lot of interest into food and went to college to learn in London to learn how to run hotels and restaurants. And in the second summer of the 3-year course, when we were expected to work in a hotel or restaurant, I ended up working in a chicken slaughterhouse. And it was that summer of 1973, when I was a student working in the chicken slaughterhouse, that began to trip the sequence of events
Mm.
that led me to become a vegetarian first and then become a vegan in 1976 and introduced me to the animal rights movement. And that, as they say, the rest is history.
Absolutely. Well, that does sound like a very formative experience, if not traumatic. And I understand how that could have tripped this arc that you've been on. And I understand now that you're very interested in animal biography. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that, what that is, and how you found your way to that specific work?
Well, the way through to animal biography is through Topsy, and Topsy was as you said earlier, was the female Asian elephant who was electrocuted to death on Coney Island in 1903. And I first learned about Topsy, and then frankly forgot about her. Then got reintroduced back to her some years later, and I made a sort of promise to myself that because the film of her electrocution is just so awful to watch, that and just incomprehensible, I thought I really wanted to do something to mark her memory and give value to her life.
Mhm.
And it took a long while to figure out what it was that I wanted to do. And I was friends with the author Elizabeth Hess in New York, who wrote a great book called Nim Chimpsky. In fact, I've got it here, and I can hold up the cover so that we can see the book.
Mm.
And this is a biography of Nim Chimpsky, who was the first chimpanzee to be taught American Sign Language. And in talking with Elizabeth about the book and reading the book, I got introduced to the idea of animal biography. I say introduced to the idea of animal biography, but really animal biography is all around us. We just
Mm.
don't often recognize it.
Mm.
And and when I thought back about it, I thought, well, I've been reading animal biography on and off throughout my life, but not really registering that that was what was happening. So I dug off my bookshelves here in my library in my office and found this copy of Watership Down. And
Mm.
this was published. This was my copy that I bought in 1974, and this is the copy that I read. But it's the biography of a group of rabbits, and then I began to realize that there can be animal biographies which are fiction, and animal biographies of non-fiction. And then putting eventually two and two together, I thought, well, what I can do for Topsy is write her biography. And that's how I sort of resulted in being in the place where I am now.
Absolutely. And for those of us who don't know, how would you describe animal biography? What constitutes animal biography?
That's an interesting question. What constitutes animal biography is telling the story of an individual animal's life or group of animals' lives through their perspective.
Hmm.
Um, and so with Topsy, I eventually worked out the way to tell her story was through three voices. Um, Now, with Nim Chimpsky, Elizabeth Hess's book, she tells the story as an investigative journalist because her
Mm.
profession is journalism, and there's no first person writing in it. It's really a third person account of this is what happened, and this is what happened, and this is what happened. Now, with Topsy, after much thinking and experimenting, I've come to the conclusion that the way for me to tell her story in the way that I want to tell it is that it's in three voices. The first voice is as an investigative reporter, as a journalist, writing the third person, narrating the sequence of events of her life. The second voice is my own personal voice, my interpretation of what I think is happening and my critique of it as an animal rights advocate. And
Mm.
then the third voice is in her own voice. I'm imagining what I think she is thinking and how she's communicating and feeling. And And it's the combination of these three voices, I think, that will enable me to tell the story in the way that I want to tell her story. There is one book already published, which is the biography of Topsy, but it's written in the third person. It's written by an investigative journalist, and I don't think it really conveys what I feel the reader should feel about is putting themselves into the place of her and what she thought and felt
Mm,
and experienced.
yeah. That makes a lot of sense. It sounds really fantastic, and we can be sure to link the information to your book and anything else you want to share with everyone here today in the YouTube. So we'll be sure to do that. But you mentioned at the start of this conversation, you were talking about your shift from working in restaurants and hotels to animal rights and how the working in the chicken slaughterhouse was very critical in that shift. Can you tell us a little bit about what that shift looked like for you? The kind of process of that's a significant career shift. So, was there anything else involved in that, or other than the slaughterhouse, which sounds extremely formative? But what did that look like for you? What jobs did you seek out initially? Or was this more of a shift, not necessarily in career first, but in personal ethic?
I Because of my parents and our origins from a working class family, I've always been very sensitive to social justice issues,
Mm,
and my politics have always been on the left. Um, the experience of the chicken slaughterhouse was something that I consciously knew that I was going in to do.
mm,
And I had to get a summer job to earn some money, and I didn't really want to work in a kitchen or a restaurant because I thought that was what I was going to do for the rest of my life. And friends who were other colleges and universities at that time talked about getting a job in this chicken slaughterhouse, and I got the job there, worked the summer there, and then when I went back to college for my final year, in the year below me was the only vegetarian I knew at that time.
mm,
And her name was Amanda or Mandy. And we were good friends. And the sort of being the typical male, look at what I've been doing, and playing a macho fool, I tried to sort of upset her with stories and accounts of what I experienced working in the chicken slaughterhouse. But she argued back, and we had several months of a toing and froing of a conversation between us. And eventually, she made me realize that what I had been involved with and what I'd been responsible for, bearing in mind that I never worked on the killing part of the production line, I always worked on the post killing part of the production line, but I could never bring myself to go and watch the chickens being killed.
mm,
So there was some latent sensitivity there. But as a consequence of my argument with Mandy over the period of the months, I began to realize that what I had been responsible was wrong, that it fitted into my sort of political worldview. And so during the December of 73, I began to realize that I had no option other than to become vegetarian. And I thought I'd make the decision that I would become a vegetarian from January 1, 1974. This meant that I had to finish the course cooking meat as a vegetarian and handling it and serving it. And I asked Mandy, well, how do you cope with that? And she's, how do you cope with cooking meat and you're supposed to taste it and all the rest of it? And she said, well, you fake it. You fake the testing. You bring the spoon up to your lips, but you don't take it in. You pretend that you've tasted it. And I thought, okay, well, I can do that for the remaining months of the course. I completed the course, and I was living at home at the time, and of course, being a teenage rebellious young man, I would argue with my mum in particular about the fact that I was going to become a vegetarian, and sort of intuitively knowing that really she ought to be a vegetarian too, because she always loved animals and she always talked about how she wanted to work with animals but never had the opportunity to do so. So we would argue backwards and forwards about eating meat. Meanwhile, she continued to cook for me and cook vegetarian food for me, which I, of course, just unquestionably accepted that should be the case. And eventually, we decided to call a truce, that we wouldn't argue about it because we just didn't get anywhere with it. And some months went by whereby we didn't talk about it. But eventually, there was a point when I started up again and I said, look, why aren't you a vegetarian? You should be a vegetarian. And she turned to me to say, well, when was the last time you saw me eat meat? And it had turned out that she had become a vegetarian, but hadn't told me and wanted to see if I would notice, which of course I didn't, which sort of rather put me in my place. So she and I became vegetarian, and I worked in various local hospitals on the catering side. And then the next step was that we heard about being vegan and veganism. And at the very beginning of January 1974, was it 74? No, 76, 1976. So long ago now, I have to remember what year we're talking about. 1976. The Vegan Society had a program on the BBC television, which they produced about themselves, and both Mum and I watched it, and we thought that what their argument that they made was correct. So we then decided to become vegetarian, become vegan at the beginning of 1976, and we carried on being vegan. So I was vegetarian from 1974, and then vegan from 1976. My mum subsequently died quite early in the mid 80s, but I carried on being a vegan from 1976.
That's incredible. That's such a it's really interesting to hear just the arc of that and the evolution, because I think that reflects this is reflected in a lot of us as far as the kind of one foot in front of the other. You learn more, you adapt, you learn more, you adapt. Would you say that your present work and view of veganism, vegetarianism, and animal biography, everything that kind of makes up what we've been talking about. Do you feel that that's reflective of who you are, your personal arc and trajectory, or do you see that there's still more to be integrated or changed?
Gosh, still more to be integrated. I don't know whether I could accommodate anything more. My politics are still very much on the left. I see being vegan and being involved with animal rights as integral to it. Um, as I reach this sort of point in my life, I've had to focus clearly on a specific number of projects, to think that I've got so many years left in me to be able to work, and I am committed to getting those projects completed, and then at
Mhm.
some point possibly I will stop, but I won't. I will always be vegan, and I always will, campaign for animal rights.
Yeah,
So throughout the nearly 50 years of being involved full time in animal rights, I've been very fortunate in many ways to get to know people and learn about the issues, and be involved with various different projects. But I'm really quite happy with the projects I've got left to work with, and I'm not looking to do anything more other than to write Topsy's biography. And
yeah,
my office is sort of becoming a production office of things to do with Topsy, and then to finish the work with Tiram Recht on the animal archiving, and then that is it. It's over to everyone else to carry on with the work.
Absolutely. And you've mentioned Topsy a number of times and what a formative experience it was learning about her. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about Topsy and that story?
Yes, that's an interesting one because I first saw the film. When she was electrocuted, it was filmed, and the film is available on YouTube. If you just search Topsy the elephant, you can find it and watch it. I don't recommend it, but it is there to watch. It's about a minute long, and it's silent, black and white, and it's the electrocution of an elephant. Now, in the early 1980s, some colleagues were involved with a project, which was a documentary film called the Animals film, and I was invited to see a private showing of the rough cut of the film before it got publicly released. And at the very beginning of this film, they have the footage of Topsy, and and I can remember seeing it and thinking about it, and the film had a huge impact upon me because I had never seen or experienced such a thing as watching for about 90 minutes, just this continuous roll of footage of animals being abused. I can remember going home and it having a big, deep psychological impact. But then some years went by, some considerable amount of time, and I think, forgot about Topsy. I'm busy working on other animal projects. And then when I was working in America in the mid 90s, another project came along, which was a film, another documentary about animals made by a filmmaker called Jane Loder, who had co-produced a film called The Atomic Cafe, which I do recommend. And that film is about the sort of duck and cover 1950s American culture of teaching children to react if there's an atomic war. And the film is entirely made of pre-existing footage. And Jane had woven a narrative for this film from pre-existing footage to tell the story about our relationship with animals. And at the beginning of the film, again, was this footage of Topsy being electrocuted. And I can remember asking, and it had a profound impact upon me again. And I remember asking Jane about it, saying, why would someone electrocute an elephant? Why would someone film it? And I discovered that this film of her electrocution is recognized as an historic moment in filmmaking history, because it was an early piece of footage, and it's thought to be the first or among the first of footage of death and of an animal being deliberately killed. So it's got a historic moment in the history of movie making.
Mm.
And that's how I got reintroduced back to Topsy. And again, this was in the mid 1990s. Fast forward another 20 years, and here I am. I'm still working on Topsy. So there was I wanted that it was at that point in the mid 90s. I thought I really want to do something about Topsy, and tried to sort of get projects off the ground and not really know exactly what short to do. But it led to a focus upon me writing her biography, and as other projects and other commitments ended, I was able to terminate my involvement with them. It gave me more free time to be able to work on Topsy. So to the
Yeah,
point where I'm now basically this is among my takes up 3/5 of my working time.
yeah. Wow, that's incredible and such a I'd not heard of her before working with you last summer. And it's just fascinating to hear about the cultural impact that had in filmmaking because it's a whole other layer to the absolute horror of what it is.
Well,
What?
there's an
Yeah.
interesting, just sorry about in, but there's an interesting footnote about the film of her electrocution, is that because there's a lot of misunderstandings about Topsy,
Mm,
and one of them is that is people often say to me, "Oh, that's the elephant that Edison electrocuted to death,"
mm,
and Edison had nothing to do with Topsy's electrocution. He wasn't present. He there was a the company that filmed the electrocution had Edison in its name, but it had nothing to do with it. He didn't flip the switch for electrocution. He wasn't present. There was a company that filmed it that was an old company of his, but he no longer owned it, but it had his name in it. So part of the job I'm discovering that I have to do is to unravel the myths about Topsy and correct them and state
yeah,
the true facts of the circumstances. And that's one of them.
that's very interesting. That is definitely is a very important misconception to write. What other kinds of barriers have you come up against, either in the work just with Topsy or your personal arc as a vegan and animal rights advocate? I imagine there have been sticking points, and I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about those.
Well, let's stay focused on Topsy and then we can broaden it out later. So in writing her biography, what I'm discovering is that there is not a great deal known about her. Um, and more is known about her final year alive and how she died than most of the rest of her life. So I'm having to sort of research and piece together and read up about what happened to other elephants like her during this time.
Yeah.
What's known is that she was born in 1875, somewhere in Southeast Asia, don't know where, and that she traveled to New York from Hamburg. So I've had to piece together how she got from somewhere in Southeast Asia by ship up through the Suez Canal, then train across Europe to Hamburg, and then from how she was shipped from Hamburg to New York.
Mm.
So there's a lot of piecing together and frankly, not imagining, but doing guesswork about what actually happened to her. There are some accounts. There are two sources of information that are contemporaneous. So the first is newspaper articles published at that time, and I've built an archive of the coverage that I've been able to find so far. And a lot of the reporting in the newspapers is it's hysterical, it's exaggerated, it's sensational. We think we have a press now that we can't trust. It was even worse, more than 100 years ago. And often, a city would there would be one newspaper that would have a monopoly in a city. So there was very little accountability. So there is the contemporaneous newspaper accounts of what happened to her and other elephants. And circuses and zoos did kill other elephants. Topsy is not unique. She's unique in how she was killed, but not in the actual killing of elephants at that time. And then the other source of information that's contemporaneous is that the circuses themselves would publish their own annual books, route books, or route books, ROUTE. So these were basically diaries of the itineraries that they took, the dates where they performed in certain cities, and there'll be summary accounts of what happened, list of the people working there, list of the animals, lists of anyone being injured or fatalities, and what happened to the animals. And there's a couple I've got where Topsy is mentioned, but then it gets complicated because the circus who owned Topsy, owned, I put in quotes, who owned Topsy was called Forepaugh, which is spelled Forepaugh. And the Forepaugh circus, among its small herd of elephants it had two elephants called Topsy. to confuse things even more. And the other Topsy was a male African. So when you read the reports, you've got to sort of make sure they're talking about a female Asian and not the male African. And then because they had two elephants called Topsy, our Topsy, as I kind of end up referring to her, they often shortened her name to Tops. So if you're reading about Tops, the elephant, that's probably going to be the female Asian Topsy elephant. Um, so the challenge is in telling her story is trying to piece it together like a jigsaw and make up the jigsaw as you go along, basically. Um, and I'm going to end up making assumptions and assertions that I can't quite factually accurately prove, but they are, I think, good guesses
Mhm.
of what happened. So, for example, I'm sort of guessing that she was probably caught in Sri Lanka, possibly Thailand, possibly India. But I think, from what I can tell, is that most of the elephants at that time were coming out of Sri Lanka. But I don't know for sure. But the bigger question about other challenges, well, gosh, there are so many in campaigning for animal rights. Well, where to start? It's like living in a parallel universe, isn't it? When our eyes and hearts are open to how we treat animals and having to live in a society that is blind to it and doesn't see it, doesn't want to see it, doesn't like us for pointing it out, but it's all around us, and we're constantly bombarded with microaggressions of animal abuse, and um, and it's living with that day to day. It takes a toll, and it's a big psychological impact, and we have to learn how to live with that. And it's not easy. I still
Yeah.
get very upset about animal abuse. I'm very exercised at the moment by what's going on in the Middle East, without wanting to comment about one side or another. But watching footage by organizations in the Lebanon at the moment, for example, who are pulling kittens out from bombed buildings and putting themselves and other animals, not just kittens, but that footage is in my mind, and seeing animal advocates so incredibly bravely going about the business of rescuing animals from the most horrendous circumstances and putting themselves at risk. And I'm just in awe of them.
Yeah.
Um, but I'm not there. I can talk about them through my social media and support them in any ways that I can. But that's an obstacle, if ever there was one, and we don't even have that to deal with. But we have to deal with dealing with people who we respect but are and know where we are with what we think strongly, but just don't embrace it. And that's a constant issue for me.
Yeah.
That's just one.
It's a big one, though. It's a big one.
It's a big one.
How would you say, you mentioned that it's still very upsetting for you, and we're always at Kerulos talking about ways to kind of like accept and allow that experience of being just devastated by these things and trying to take action to make a positive impact. And how would you say that you have or are trying to learn to hold these things? What do you do to cope or get involved in a new way? How would you say you kind of get through this?
Well, one of the biggest ways to get through it all is just to keep working on it, is to not let go of it.
Yeah.
And I've been very fortunate that I've been able to dedicate through no design, but by accident, to be able to have my working life dedicated to animal rights. That
Yeah,
is such a gift.
absolutely.
It's not always been easy, but it shouldn't be easy. But I do I do have interests away from animals that help me escape and not think about it.
Yeah.
I do like reading. I read a lot. I read fiction. There's certain novelists I like to read. I don't watch very much at all now. I listen to things and I watch things, and I'm sorry, I listen and I read. That's
Yeah.
mostly. And I have a strong interest in history, which is there's a lot of history here in England, um, and we have opportunities to visit historic houses and gardens, and I have a strong interest in that, and that's how I escape, really.
Absolutely. So, for any of us looking to get more involved in this kind of work, or just in having these conversations, what would you say to them? Where would you recommend they start, or what action, whether that's something to read or watch? What would you suggest to others?
Everyone's beginning is different, and where to start is different for everyone. Where to start? If you I don't know where to start. Where to start? Um, I'm surrounded by more than 2,500 books to do with animals. Read a book,
Yeah.
find a book about animal issues and read it,
Hmm.
and just keep reading. I'm not a big advocate. I know we increasingly live in a visual world and that we're bombarded by visual images, especially on the internet. But my preference is reading because I think that when you read something, there's an element of imagination. There's a gap that you have to fill when you read something. And I think that what we bring as individuals to the reading experience adds so much value to what it is that you're reading that it enriches it. And reading, there are some great novels about animals, and find those and read those. That I think is for me. That's how I would if I had to start again. That's I think that's how I probably would start.
Yeah.
Watching animal abuse is very distressing, and disempowering. Although a lot of people get empowered by it. I've written in the past about how we as animal rights people go through personal transformative moments, and these are moments when the veil is lifted on animal abuse and we begin to see what is going on around us. We
Mm.
see what is behind the piece of meat on the plate. We see what's in the bottle of shampoo. We see what we begin to able to imagine the experiences of animals in cages, and that personal transformative moment is powerful. It's visceral, and it transforms lives. And I think because it becomes so transformative, I think we tend to think that if only we could create for others, for them to experience their own personal transformative moments, that they too will also embrace the animal rights message. Well, we know that people are being subjected to images of animal abuse and subjected to messages from animal rights, but they are not having personal transformative moments. So not everyone is unfortunately going to make the changes that we change, and I think that's an unfortunate fact about humanity, but I think it's a realistic one that not everyone is going to embrace animal rights in the same way as we do and become vegan. I think increasingly more people will, but I think there's always going to be some who won't.
Yeah.
So I'm a great believer in not only personal change but also institutional change with
Mhm.
laws and public policy, which
Mhm.
basically mandates people's behavior.
Yeah.
Um,
Mhm. Absolutely. Thank you, Kim. That's fantastic, and I think reading a book and we've got a couple of good recommendations here just from our conversation that people can start with. So I think that's a fantastic place to start. And I totally understand why I think there's something about imagining something for yourself, the way it looks, how it feels, that's different than just having it kind of reflected to you. It puts you in it in a whole different way. So I love that suggestion. And for anybody here, we'll have the links to Kim's work in the YouTube and all the books that he's mentioned so far today. But I think we can open. I know there's a question in the chat, and if anyone else has anything that they'd like to ask or share, go ahead and write it in the chat. Or if you need to unmute yourself, if that's easier, that's fine. But we'll start with Isabella, who says, "Hi, wonderful to listen to you again. Wisdom and compassion. I look forward to the Topsy book. I'm sure you're aware of these, but just in case they may offer suggestion of ways to go or not to go. Barbara Gowdy's novel The White Bone about elephants, and Charles Foster's superb collection of stories told from the perspective of various animals, Cry of the Wild."
I'm not aware of Charles Foster and Cry of the Wild. I will look that up.
Isabel, if there's anything you'd like to add to your comment, go right ahead. Otherwise, if anyone else. Yes, hi, Izzy.
Hi, hi, Kim. Yeah, that Charles Foster book. I don't know if you've read his Being a Beast book as well. He does a kind of, I suppose it's an experiential or phenomenological exploration into maybe you could call it corporeal conviviality, and spends time. He researches various different animals familiar to the English countryside, British countryside, and spends time it really diving into their habitat and exploring the conditions in which they live. And that book was, it's very strange but very informative. And interesting. But Cry of the Wild is a series. I can't remember how many stories there are, but the animals he looks at: otters, foxes, rabbits, a gannet, I think, a mayfly, which is sort of incredible. And all of the stories are told not necessarily in the first person, but from the perspective of the animal. And they are stories where you do have to kind of stay with the trouble, as it were, because these are stories about the real things that can or could happen. But it's incredibly powerful, and also suggests his depth of research. And I think that as a book for people who are starting to become aware of their concerns about animals, that reading that book could very much open their eyes to a more than human reality.
I think I've seen him speak a long time ago at a conference. Doesn't he actually sort of go and live as a badger somewhere? Or
Yes.
yeah,
Yes.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yes, he takes he's got a friend who lives in the Welsh Hills, and they scooped out a sort of man-sized set in
Mm-hmm.
a hill, and he actually went with his youngest son.
Son,
uh,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah,
Okay.
and so the boy was maybe 8 or something, and he talks about how the little boy adapted to badger living very swiftly, and they sort of crawled about in the undergrowth in the evening. So the whole thing sounds very, very bizarre, but there's something there's something kind of charming about it, but there's also something about that willingness to really to not say, I'm looking at you from my all too human, godlike, objective perspective. And I think that's really interesting. One of the animals is a red deer, and he actually at the time, I'm not sure if he still was, he shoots and red deer were one of the animals that he looks at. It makes it kind of strange to consider that he could be involved in something like shooting, but he's an interesting chap, because I think he's qualified as a lawyer and a veterinarian, and writes philosophical papers as well from a kind of interesting ethical perspective.
Huh. I didn't know that about him. I will check the books out for sure. Thank you.
Thank you, Izzy.
I just put into chat one of my favorite animal character novels. Is The Tiger of Malgudi by R.K. Narayan, who's an Indian writer, and he's written a series of books about a fictional Indian village called Malgudi. And The Tiger of Malgudi has two protagonists. One is a holy man, and the other is a tiger. And the voice of the novel switches effortlessly between the two. And I won't give away the narrative arc, the storyline, but I've read it several times, and I find it quite a moving story.
Mm-hmm. That sounds fantastic. Thank you for typing that into chat. We keep track of usually the resources that are mentioned in people's talks, so we can disperse them to everybody after the fact, because they're so useful to have those personal recommendations for things, especially when you've heard the backstory for a person. So thank you for that. That sounds really fascinating. Would anybody else like to ask or share anything about Kim's talk or what was mentioned here before we wrap up?
I do. Hi, Kim. This is
Hello,
good.
Gay.
Hi, lovely to see you. Lovely
Yes,
to
and
see
you.
everyone. I'd love to go in your library.
You're very welcome.
I have a couple of comments/questions. Just while we're on the book club type of that, there was an author named Sally Carrigar, Carrighger. I don't know if you're familiar or anyone is. I read
No.
her as a child. One of her books is called One Day at Teton Marsh, and she has others. And the One Day at Teton Marsh, every chapter, Izzy, this is kind of a follow-up on the chapter, is an individual, like a hawk or a beaver or one. I think it's a trout. And so she tells their experience one day. In other words, there's a hawk that's trying to catch, or an eagle trying to catch the trout. So she does that. I really recommend it. Her work is really, really quite phenomenal. And so that's just kind of that. But I have a couple. One is that I wrote when my elephant book, Elephants on the Edge, came out. A number of people approached me, and several of them were teachers. Largely here, there was a couple in Britain, but a couple here, and they asked me, "Oh, please write a children's book." And I was very reluctant because as I said, I know what I can do and I know what I can't do. I know my BS factor kind of thing, and it just didn't really feel comfortable as much as I, have read and read, quote unquote, children's book, which I think is a misnomer. Anyways, I finally got coerced. So I poured myself a big glass of red wine and I said, okay, I'm going to write something, start to write something, and then that'll shut everyone up. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because I just wanted to hear your comment. And so what came out of it was called The Elephant Letters, the story of Billy and Connie. If you have time, take a look at it. I'd be, curious to see what your thoughts are. But when I sat down, it was really a kind of, and I use this in quotation marks, a channeling. And Billy and Connie are two elephants that are separated. They're cousins in Africa. And it just popped out. This was nothing that was particularly conscious or cognitive. The process was not. Connie stays in the wild, and Billy goes to a zoo. And so this is their correspondence, and so it goes back and forth between that. And it's written in the sense of a first person in both cases. And Billy, of course, is the arc. He actually was inspired by an elephant in the Los Angeles Zoo who is still kept in prison there, named Billy. I just kind of wanted, I didn't mean to get into this whole thing, but for me, the process was just, as like I said, a kind of a channeling. there wasn't any kind of, I mean, I did go back later. The children in one class would read it. And I'll just tell you one thing that was quite wonderful is that the children, it was in a reading class, and each child would read one of the roles. And they became that. They started to become that person, that Billy or Connie. So I just wanted to ask you, that was a long-winded introduction to asking you in terms of Topsy, when you talk about your voice, does that relate to your experience at all? Or I mean, do you feel that difference between sort of an inner, I mean, I'm calling it channeling versus a more of a conscious?
Well, you're onto something there. I think I wasn't aware of the book, The Elephant Letters, and I'll get hold of a copy. I mean, I've got to say that this book is phenomenal, and I'm mining it a lot to sort of give me inspiration. When I write in, I'm in the process of writing a character profile of Topsy, so that I can know her personality, know what she physically looks like. But I'm frankly basing her personality on mine. She's going to be cantankerous, she's going to be short-tempered, I'm going to channel my own feelings into her, because I think that that's probably the best way for me to think about how she's going to react to what happened to her, because I can imagine my own life and how I would react if I were her and how she was going to behave. So it's a bit of a channeling. I'm also in part inspired because of what you've written. And partly from another elephant-based novel I've read. I'm looking at, it's up over there. I have to go and get it to remember exactly what it's called. But I'm giving something called the elephant mind, whereby they can collectively connect to the elephant mind, and which is extending what you've written about the way in which they can communicate beyond our ability to hear and experience what they're communicating. I want them to have, and they will have in my account, Topsy, a form of ESP to be able to communicate with each other over distances, over time, with the living and the dead. So the biography is not a traditional biography. It's going to be an embellished biography, if you like. It's going to be some fiction with some biography in it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I just like to hear your process in that. And I guess I would suggest that it's not embellished, but rather expanded.
Expanded, okay.
But when you were talking about, ESP with their communication, Daphne Sheldrick, we spoke, and she said they use telepathy, and I mean, and Daphne was a very no nonsense person, highly sensitive, but very no nonsense. So I think that's really wonderful what you're doing. I'm going to squeeze. I don't want to take too much time because I know others want to talk, but I wanted to comment on your parallel universe, like parallel realities, that comment that you make. And do you see that your own process, and also you can say even collectively process, of transformation to this other reality, or the reality, I would say, do you think that's a fulcrum? In other words, animal rights is really a fulcrum from the shift, collective human consciousness shift from duality to non-duality? I know that sounds kind of academic, but I mean, in a sense of that, it just seems to be, like you said, that we can be exposed to something and feel the horror, but not have that internal transformation. So I guess I'm just sort of echoing what I feel is that animal rights per se, and the shift to veganism in a profound transformative way, is really a fulcrum of the evolution of human consciousness.
I think you're right. I agree with you. And I feel that living as a vegan and embracing animal rights, and especially placing it within a broader left agenda, that it is one of the closest ways that we can live our liberation, is by living as a vegan animal rights person. as opposed to espousing a political theory as a theory, or living as a vegan is more about the practice of being able to live as in a liberated world.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your questions, Gay. Rob, we see your hand. Would you like to ask or comment something?
Yeah. Hi, Kim.
Rob.
Nice to connect in this way as well as via email recently. Yeah, I've got two very simple questions actually. One is I've been puzzled about why Topsy was killed and electrocuted in particular. I don't think you've said that this evening, and I don't know anything about Topsy apart from what I've heard via you. So that's a simple question, I would think, but maybe not. The other question is, you've worked as an animal rights campaigner in both the USA and in the UK, and I wondered whether you found big differences between the two atmospheres that you worked in. You know, what do you find it easier or harder in one or the other countries?
Okay.
Challenges.
Right. Rob, thank you very much for the question. It's good to meet you in person or virtually. The reason why they killed Topsy and why other elephants in similar circumstances were also killed, and some of them killed in equally but different horrific ways, is because elephants get musk, which is a state of heightened neurological. The Gay is going to be much better explaining this than me, where they become agitated and they become uncontrollable as far as being able to manage them, and they are wild animals caught within a tamed quote situation. So often what happened with these elephants is that they would attack and kill people, and they would go from being an asset to being a liability. And at that time, in the late 1800s, turn of the century, there were no elephant sanctuaries for them to go to. So if you owned an elephant and you had a circus and an elephant become troublesome, they were often renamed, given a completely new history, and then sold on to another circus, or they were killed. And sometimes they were killed quietly, sometimes they were killed publicly, and they were killed in various ways. With Topsy, there was a sequence of events whereby she defended herself against a drunk man who assaulted her, and she consequently picked him up and threw him to the ground and kneed into him and killed him. And then about a week later, this first incident happened in Brooklyn, New York, and then the second incident happened in a town about a week later in Connecticut, when they went on to perform in another location. And as a young man who I believe was sober approached her with a stick, and what is reported in the press at that time is that he approached Topsy with this branch to tickle her behind the ear. But she was, because she had just killed this person, they'd wrapped her up in even more chains and halters, and her movement was restricted. And because I'm sort of dodging around here, because they're trained with these metal crowbars with hooks at the end of them, called anks, or I forget, there's another word they call them with. I think Topsy thought he was going to strike her with this branch or stick, and so she went to assault him as well, and that tripped it as far as the circus in deciding that they no longer wanted to keep her because she became so problematic, and there was a lot of bad press about her. And so they sold her on, and they sold her on to someone who had an amusement park on Coney Island, and he quickly sold her on to someone else, and the owners who then bought her were the two people who were building Coney Island, building Luna Park on Coney Island, and Luna Park was another amusement park. And she had a keeper who was a drunkard who abused her, and various incidents happened, and the two owners decided that they no longer wanted to put up with her. And this was at the beginning of January 1904 or 03. I'm blanking on the year. I think it's 1903, but it could be 4. And they were opening up their amusement park, what was called Luna Park, in the spring. So they didn't want to keep her anymore. They didn't know what to do with her. And they had the Luna Park opening up. And so they killed her because they no longer wanted her. But they used it as a publicity stunt for the opening of Luna Park.
Wow.
And then they had to decide how to kill her. And electricity was in the forefront of this time. And the War of Currents had happened in the late 1880s, but they were over. This is the War of Currents between Westinghouse and Edison, between AC and DC. And so electrocution of dogs and other animals was beginning to come into practice. The ASPCA initially opposed the killing because they didn't want it to be a public event, but they didn't oppose the electrocution of killing her. And to get around the opposition to a public event, the two owners sold tickets to make it a private event, and about 1,000 people bought tickets to watch her electrocution as seemingly a private event. The ASPCA was present, and so they electrocuted her because they no longer wanted her. They couldn't manage her, and they did it as a publicity stunt to advertise the opening of Luna Park in May, in a couple of months' time from when they killed her.
Thank you. That sounded dreadful.
It is dreadful. And I mean, part of one of the questions that I want to answer with the book is, what would happen to Topsy if she were alive today? And are we making any progress? And I'm going to give a very mixed report about this, because elephants are still being killed by electricity in India. Not in the same way that Topsy was killed, but wild elephants walking about the Indian countryside, trampling crops grown by people, and some farmers take electric cables and lower them so that they are at the height of elephants, and if they object to these elephants walking across their land, they will get electrocuted and they will kill them, and they will deliberately lower the cables so they're exposed to electrocution. Elephants are also still killed in India by trains. Jumbo was killed by a train, and many elephants. I have a constant feed of news to do with elephants, and I almost on a daily basis, certainly at least once a week, I get a news report from India of elephants being killed by trains, sometimes trucks, but mostly trains, and then electric cables being drooped to catch them and kill them. So, are we treating elephants any better than how Topsy was treated? I'm not so sure. In some ways, yes, because there are now elephant sanctuaries, and maybe Topsy would have gone into an elephant sanctuary if they existed in 1903. Maybe she wouldn't have. But elephants are still being electrocuted today. I don't think we're treating elephants any better on the whole. Comparisons between animal rights advocacy in Britain and America. Well, it's changed a lot over the years, over the decades that I've been involved. I think that when I first went to America in 1980 and connected with animal activists then, I would say in 1980, Britain was advanced in comparison to the US. I don't think that anymore. I think that in the USA, generally speaking, the movement there is a bit more organized, a bit more sophisticated. Animal law organizations are a bit more evolved. Animal studies is a bit more evolved in academia, and the organizations are generally larger and more moneyed, and just have a bigger reach. Having said that, however, I do feel I have criticisms of animal groups, regardless of the country in which I alluded to earlier, which is I think a lot of what animal groups do is as a consequence of the personal transformative moment, in that they think that if you look at a lot of the activities, I think they're geared up towards having creating in people to have this personal transformative moment. And the animal movement, generally speaking, sees the animal issue as a personal lifestyle choice, not as a socio-economic political issue. I believe at the end of the day, how we treat animals is a political issue, and that we need to get animal rights embedded into mainstream politics, which a lot of people in the animal movement don't understand or don't agree with. And then I think there's a further point I would make, which is that animal organizations and charities, by their very nature of being a non-profit, a charity, or some other institution, their very entities are inadequate vehicles to create social change. Because charity, however laudable and good that it is a temporary fix to a problem that's been caused by socio-economic political forces. And as vehicles, I think they are inadequate to really create big social change. And that's why I think that we need to move the animal issue into the mainstream political arena, because ultimately it's a political issue.
That's interesting, because I'm very I come from an animal rights background. That's what prompted me. But I've also a chartered environmentalist, which is a UK qualification. But so I'm very interested in the sort of climate change rationale and the ecological rationale for being dietary change. And there's, I mean, it's interesting. I keep on thinking of the elephant in the room, but it's the cow in the room in the debates amongst politicians. In as much as they can't see that there's a need to tackle that. Well, they won't see a need to tackle the cow in the room in terms of the climate change impacts of diet and the ecological impacts. So if they won't see it when, we're facing an existential crisis with regard to the climate, will they see it in terms of an animal rights political agenda?
Probably not. I mean, ultimately, I think that we are selfish animals and are forced to react when we have to. And the foreseeable future, I would expect, is going to be more challenging to us as a species because of what we're doing to the planet. And until affluent societies are forced to confront the outcomes of what we're doing to the planet, they're not going to change. and there's going to be a lot of greenwashing, a lot of humane washing, a lot of capital washing, but ultimately it's when the entities of things like factory farming become totally unsustainable and collapse because there's no longer any fresh water. There's that we have become immune to vaccines and antibiotics. When our lives are threatened by it and our assets are threatened by it, then I think change will happen. Will it be too late? Possibly. I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah, I agree with you that it's calamity that prompts change, isn't it?
It is. It's the trigger, but the solution is politics.
Thank you very much for answering my questions.
You're very welcome. Good to meet you.
And you.
Thank you, Rob. Those great questions, and thank you, Kim, for your explanations. Yeah, go ahead, Gay.
Sorry, well, while you were talking, I put a few things with misspellings in the chat about Sally Carragher. And then a link, I think, that works. There's a fellow named Deke Weaver. He's a professor and he does performance arts.
Okay.
And he has it's called Elephant. So he calls it, I think it's the unreliable bestiary. He's going through the alphabet. Right now he's working on cetacean. So he does elephant, and that pivots around an elephant that was executed as well in the United States. And I think that the link I sent you works, but you can look at that. And then there's a book called I Loved Rogues. I put that in.
I have it. I do have it.
Okay, all right. It's a very interesting and I think very informative, kind of raw type of thing.
Well, it's them writing about what they do themselves. You know,
Yes.
It's total truth about what they did to animals, and shocking photographs in that book, I think.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm not aware of Deke Weaver. I will look him up.
Mhm. Thank you for the resources, Gay, and that I checked the link. It works well, so everybody should be able to access that. Would anyone else like to ask or share anything before we wrap up today?
I'll add one more thing. When you talked about the political, we had, I think, Olivia, maybe a year ago, 2 years ago, we had a series in Living One called Veganism at the Crossroads. And one of the speakers is Tom Harris, who's an activist, animal rights activist. And his topic was veganism and looking at the relationship between, well, actually veganism and capitalism. So that might be something interesting for people to look at. So it kind of digs down to that, what you're talking about, the political level.
Mm-hmm.
I
Thank you.
will make a comment about the political, and I don't know whether you want to expand on that a little more. It's my experience that in some ways there's at least a sort of a vein or a streak in the United States culture that is very apolitical, meaning, hands off. We don't talk about it. It's kind of a force field. And in the sense of that, it's not so ingrained in all aspects of American life and society. And I wonder if you make a comment about that, as opposed to my perception and experience, say in the UK or elsewhere, or in France, where politics is kind of a dinner time discussion. It's very much, it's not something that you don't bring up, whereas in the United States and a lot of different, a lot of communities and subcultures, you don't bring it up.
I would say in the UK it varies. You hear that some families, politics was a topic that was routinely discussed around the dinner table, and then you hear of other families where they never talk politics, and then also we're living in a time at the moment where a lot of people are fed up and have turned away from politics, and don't want to talk about it. So Generally speaking, I think perhaps Britain and Europe, it's a bit more politically aware than in the United States, but that's a horrible generality to make. I'm not very comfortable, frankly, making it.
Okay.
And I left living in America in 2007, I think it was. So I've been away from America. I've been back a couple of times, but I've been away from America for nearly 20 years. So it's changed a lot, I think.
Thank you.
Looks like somebody is sharing a whiteboard, so I think that's probably a mistake. I'm gonna try to get out of that before we can close up here. Okay. Sorry about that, everybody. All right. Thank you, Gabe, for your question and your comment, and Kim for everything. We will wrap up here unless anybody else has anything they'd like to share. And I think actually, Gay, as far as the veganism series you were talking about, Kim was one of our guests on that series. I was trying to remember which one you were in, but I think when you were talking about veganism, Kim, I was remembering. I think that might have been when you were last here. Alrighty, well, thank you to everybody for coming today. Thank you, Kim, so much for sharing all of your time and wisdom with us. It's been great chatting with you again. And for anyone who's interested in hearing more of Kim's work and thoughts, he was a guest on Living One a couple of years ago in our veganism series, which is on our YouTube. And you can find his last appearance there. And we will be sure to link all of the work and references that he mentioned today in the recording of this recording on YouTube, which should be out in the next couple of days. Our next Living One speaker will be 1 week from today on November 1st at 10 a.m. Pacific time. We will welcome Mary Watkins, Professor Emerita of Psychology at Pacifica Graduate Institute, where she taught 27 years and co-founded the Community Liberation, Indigenous, and Eco-Psychologies program. As always, if you enjoy Living One and feel called to support Kerulos, Living One, and all of our sanctuary residents, please consider donating at the link at our bio, kerulos.org. Thank you so much, everybody, again, for sharing your time with us today. It's been really fantastic to be here with all of you. And thank you so much, Kim. Again, it's great to talk to you again.
Well, Olivia, thank you very much. It's been a great honor and a really fascinating discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right, everybody, we'll see you next week. Have a good rest of your week and weekend.